David Makovsky is a Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and director of the Koret Project on Arab-Israel relations. He's also an adjunct professor in Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins, the SAIS School, and is president of the board for the National Library of Israel's U.S. affiliate. In 2013-2014, he worked in the office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as senior advisor to Special Envoy for Israel-Palestinian negotiations. He's the author of several books on Israel and the Middle East, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, International Herald Tribune, Chicago Tribune, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and National Interest. He appears frequently in the media to comment on Arab-Israeli affairs, including the PBS NewsHour. In the last several years, he has made over 190 visits to American college campuses to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He has done a TED Talk on this issue for the college audience. We are delighted that he's addressing this college and alumni audience, and welcome all those who are joining the Sacks-Herenstein Center tonight.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Anything about Dad? Because I know it's Mother's Day, but he is an awesome dad.
I think he won the his fantasy football league at one point. I forget which year it was. But pretty good dad.
Yeah.
Solid.
Solid dad. You'll keep him. Thank you, Josh, one of our outstanding Yeshiva college students. David, it's really a delight to have you here at the Sacks-Herenstein Center. Tonight in Israel for the Yom HaZikaron Tekes, President Yitzhak Herzog spoke movingly about the immense sacrifices of these past months since October 7th. But what affected me most in listening to him was that he tore kriya on his shirt, an ancient Jewish ritual to mark mourning, for all the world to see. David, we're having this conversation while the world is on fire. You've reported on so much of that fire these past decades. Is there something different in your coverage and analysis of Israel for you since October 7th?
Well, thank you very much, Erica, for having me. And I must say, I've done a lot of speaking, but it's the first time I've ever been introduced by my son. So it's memorable.
Well, Yiddish Anachas.
That's right. So thank you for having me. And Josh, thanks for the introduction. Look, I mean, there's so many points to say. I'll say 3 points, how October 7th is a seminal moment. And it is very poignant, of course, that we're doing this at the start of Yom HaZikaron. I'd say first, it's seminal that look, the Zionist ethos has always been that stateless Jews were defenseless Jews. But this is the first pogrom during the state of Israel's existence. Now, it's not like a pogrom in the past. Here, there's an Israeli military there to defend Jews, defend the state. And the fact that people were defenseless for much of that day of October 7th, of course, will be investigated by a state commission of inquiry. But it reminds us of the fragility of Israel, that we can never take the security of Israel for granted. And this is probably the toughest Yom HaZikaron in that regard because of the scope of innocent people that were killed. There have been wars, there have been people who died in wars, 48, 56, 67, 73, the first, second intifadas, but never the scope of so many people killed at once. The worst day for the Jews has been said by many since the Holocaust. So I'd say that's one thing that stands out for me, the fragility of Israel. Another thing that stands out for me, though, is that Yom HaZikaron is followed by Yom HaAtzmaut, by Israel Independence Day. And I think historically, that's important, and I wish we in America had the same thing, that people understood the connection that freedom isn't free and that we're only free because of the sacrifices of the military and others who make Independence Day possible. So I think Israel does that very well by putting one and leading one into the other. But I think in this case, and here's, I think, the uplift, that October 7th was followed by an October 8th, by the fact that all the country came together as one. And people were counting Israel out. If you remember the October 6th world, the divisions in Israel, the polarization, pilots wouldn't fly. People would go on reserve duty. It was probably the toughest crisis the state has faced since 48. But the Arabs learned the wrong lesson. They thought Israel's weak, you strike Israel when Israel's weak. But what they didn't realize is that when Israel's attacked, Israel will come together, Israelis will come together dramatically. The sense of resilience, the sense of perseverance amid adversity. And it really, that resilience galvanized into a steely resolve. And the same people that were demonstrating and doing all this stuff suddenly were driving a group called Achim Laneshek, Brothers in Arms. They drove people to their reserve duty. The same people that were protesting against the state became the state's mobilizers. And I think that tells you something, that all the differences, left, center, right, it just melted away. And this is what the Arabs didn't get. And this is why I think in a certain way, while Yom HaZikaron will probably dwarf Yom HaTzmaut because of all the loss, is so staggering, I think Yom HaTzmaut does have a role to say that this is a country that will come together amid crisis. The Arabs and the Hamas, I should say, in this case, they, in a horrific way, for all their barbarism, the brutality, the atrocities of October 7th. I could go on about this for a long time, but I think they, in a strange way, they showed that how wrong they were, because the Israelis came together. Look at the reserve duty call-ups. It was oversubscribed, as we say. There were 360,000 people called up. The units had too many people who wanted to be there. So I think that's the second thing about October 7th. And the third thing I'll just say about October 7th, Erica, is that people have to realize how anomalous this conflict is. This is not normal, what is going on. Let me just give you two examples. And I say this, I'm on the PBS NewsHour or wherever I am. I think people need to realize that in any other conflict, you keep innocents out of harm's way. If there's something in Mosul, then the people can go to Turkey, they can go to Lebanon, they can go to Jordan. The idea is get civilians out of harm's way. This is a conflict where Egypt won't take them, Jordan won't take them. To be fair, Israel doesn't take them either, I should say, but this is a conflict where you don't take people out of Gaza because people are afraid that the temporary becomes permanent. Egypt is convinced that Israel has a conspiracy theory to export the Palestinians and dump it in their lap, so to speak. So they say, no one leaves. And the fact is that's American policy now too. That's the Arab position. So I think this is an anomaly, and therefore the amount of civilians being killed is worse. I mean, look, urban warfare is terrible under any circumstances. This is a group that takes, people under hides them as under civilians as human shields. I saw an interview of Musa Abu Marzouk, one of the leaders of Hamas, on Russian TV, and the Russian journalist asked them, he goes, you built hundreds of miles of shelters for your fighters. You didn't build, hundreds of miles of tunnels for your fighters, but not one shelter. And he goes, yeah, that's true. We didn't build any shelters for the people. That's the UN. That's their job, not our problem. So if you have a people don't care, a leadership that doesn't care about their people, you're in a different place. The second anomaly, with this I'll stop, I'm sorry, I don't want to go on too long, is that, what's anomalous is you're not facing a military. When Israel fought the militaries in 48, 56, 67, 73, they were facing armies, they had uniforms, there was the battlefield, everything was designated. Here, there's just no rules. I talked to a senior person at the White House the other day. He said, this is a problem set from hell. We've never had to deal with this before, because if you're not an army, you're not bound by international law. So we'll just take hostages too. And when you take hostages, that creates its own dynamics, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, but that's not in the regular war. So it's an urban warfare, which is hard under any circumstances. These are people that are hiding behind civilians, and you can't forget that. And I asked a senior U.S. military official who both knew Iraq and knows Gaza. If I told you it's his rank, you'd be very impressed. And I said, we asked, how is this different from what you faced in Mosul against ISIS? He says, what Israel is facing is 10x, that's a direct quote, 10x more sophisticated than anything we faced. So the challenges are greater, but the constraints are not what they were in terms of what Hamas faces a constraint, because it's not a regular military, and Hamas rules or no rules. So I would just add those 3 points together and saying October 7th, I think, is a seminal moment in Jewish history. I hope we'll remember it more for the second part, that how the people came together to defeat Hamas. We're not yet done, but it's definitely a type of conflict that nobody else basically faces in the world, because the rules that apply about getting civilians out of the way just don't exist here because of the regional environment. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we talked about the fire there and all of the anomalies of what's happened in the Middle East region since October 7th. But then, of course, there are college campuses here, and that's a separate fire. The two of us have talked about this for years, what's going on in higher education. Tell us, you've been to 190 campuses, as Josh confirmed. You keep going to campus. You've started these visits. Tell us about how you started them and what you think you're accomplishing and what's changed over the years.
Well, look, I was once, believe it or not, the head of the World Union of Jewish Students in the early 80s. Saki Anegbi, who's now national security, head of the National Security Council of Israel, was the head of the Israeli students. A guy named Yisrael Katz followed him, and I work with him too, and he's now the foreign minister of Israel. So that's, people say, the students of today are the leaders
You work
of
with David
tomorrow.
Makovsky, you go places.
I don't know. I'm not a head of government anywhere, but it really started, Lynn Schusterman saw me at a 92nd Street Y. She's a philanthropist. And she said, she just kept taking all those notes and said, would you go out to the campuses? I said, I haven't been out there since the 80s. But I thought about it, and I thought, knowledge has communal consequences. If you've devoted your life to something, just because something is difficult, it doesn't make it less important. If it's difficult, it usually means it's more important. But when I started this in 2007, 2008, it was different. What's changed, I think, is a lot of things have changed, but I think this whole intersectionality idea, which sounds like an esoteric theory, is really, I think, distorting, I worry, what maybe people came with some good intentions. I'm not saying that they didn't. But, when I went to college and to grad school, at these schools that now are kind of in the news that we don't talk about, Columbia,
You want to tell us where you went, David?
Columbia and Harvard, it was, you had to, if you want to know a conflict, you had to know the history. You had to know geography, you had to know demography, you had to know socioeconomics, you had to know governing structures of different claimants. You had to know basics, ABCs. I saw Hillary Clinton was on MSNBC, and she teaches at Columbia, and she, the other day on Morning Joe, she said, I feel the students don't know history anymore. But I'm not here to say things were always better in the past, but I'm saying that the whole idea of a university is about deepening your sense of knowledge in all directions. And maybe it's uncomfortable at times, but you need to have these exchange of views. But to kind of telescope everything to say history doesn't matter, geography doesn't matter. You don't have to know what river, what sea, socioeconomics, governing structures. None of this matters. All you have to know is who is the oppressor and who's the oppressed. Now, who defines that? Sometimes the oppressed might be, is an oppressor, but it doesn't matter. To me, it's fundamentally anti-intellectual. And I talked to a provost of a university of 25,000 students, Erica. I won't say the name here, but he said, look, the problem is It's a joke of a theory, but it's a theory that is infected social science across this country, across the United States. And we don't know how to extricate ourselves from this theory. And I'm worried that if people, pursue this and feel they don't have to know anything, they don't have to know history, they don't have to know anything, then it's a dumbing down of America. It's profoundly anti-intellectual, whatever your views are, and I think it's doing great damage. And I'm very concerned. I do think the universities are right to focus on diversity, but diversity also means diversity of thought. It also means to ensure that your student body is diverse in its ideas, and your faculty is diverse in its ideas. And I feel that part of diversity is not always given full shrift. I must say, I must say my son Josh admitted, I've been teaching at Johns Hopkins to grad students for the last 24 years, except for the office. I worked in the office of the Secretary of State, and it's been a wonderful experience. So I'm grateful to what's called the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, called SAIS, and it's been a delightful place to teach. And I love teaching graduate students, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity. But it's part of the same thinking that this isn't a cliche. You really think that these people are going to go on and into leadership roles, and you have to be out there. I really truly believe that that knowledge has communal consequences, and you can't afford to give up.
Well, number one, thank you for your service, always. I know that you used to go to campus with a Palestinian partner and colleague.
Yeah.
Are you still able to
still
do
do.
those? Yeah, you
Yeah.
still do those.
Raith Omar is a tremendous guy, and he's someone we are also trying to kind of model the idea of civility and discourse. And he happens to be a very moderate and pragmatic guy, and we tend to agree more than we disagree. And I can't. Josh mentioned I do like sports. I think we've tried to hit the home run 3 times. Clinton tried in 2000. Condoleezza Rice tried in 2007 and 8, and the third effort was the one I was a part of in 2013-14. I think these were all noble efforts, but when you try to hit the home run ball, you can strike out. When you swing for the fences, you can strike out. So I think hitting singles and doubles is the better way to go. And Raith and I tend to agree on that approach. And he's a very courageous person, and he's he would like dignity for the Palestinians, as we all would, and that means dignity for Israelis too, and he gets that, and he thinks the hope for a strong Palestinian future is that Israel is a strong country as well, if they're going to live side by side.
Yeah. What I'm hearing from you, David, is at a time where a lot of us want to withdraw from higher education, or let's say withdraw from the conversation, you're really saying lean in, be courageous.
That's it, 100%. You got it. That's the key message for me, which is we can't afford just to walk away. It's too important. And, U.S. is superpower. I think we have international responsibilities. And if you walk away, you just cede the field to people who you're not always sure shares that view of America's role in the world that I do. So 100%, Erica,
Yeah.
lean in.
I mean, it's interesting because I think from a Jewish perspective, a lot of American Jews have really been nourished on the idea of tikkun olam, and sometimes put the interests of the world, their universal interests, over the particularistic interests. And I think there's a deep, deep, profound sense of betrayal right now. And so I
That's
wonder.
right. No, you as often you nailed it. I mean, I always felt that there had to be a balance between the universalistic and the particular. And we're not post-nationalists. We don't just say, oh, we don't need a country. We're all just one universal body. No, we as Americans have our kind of American identity. And Israel is also proud of its identity. And I think that's what actually binds these two countries, that they're both a nation of immigrants, but they see in themselves, both in America and in Israel, we'll talk some more about this, but they see it within themselves, this kind of dual mission of, advancing both interests and values. And I think if we lose that balance between the particular and the universal, we'll have lost something very profound about both of our countries, both the United States and Israel, on both sides.
On both sides,
Both
universal and particularistic.
Right.
In 2009, I remember moderating a conversation about the book that you wrote with Dennis Ross, Myths, Illusions, and Peace, Finding a New Direction for America in the Middle East. And there you wrote, no longer can America afford to operate at a high level of generality and offer sweeping slogans for the region. In the intervening 15 years, I think we've seen more sweeping slogans than ever. What myths and illusions have changed for you about the Middle East? Do you think that exist now that maybe didn't exist then?
Look, I think in a good way. If you would have talked about normalization with Saudi Arabia in 2009, they would say, hey, what are you smoking? You must be on drugs. No way. If you remember the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, it was about, we'll be at the end of the rainbow. Whenever you arrange things with the Palestinians, then come to us and give us a call. If it takes 500 years, we can wait. What's changed is the Middle East has changed since 2009 and 2002. And now, I think like the Gulf Arabs in particular, they're very fearful that the United States is going to pivot to Asia to contain China, and that they've lost interest. Every time I'm in the Gulf, they'll say, hey, this member of Congress, this senator said on the Senate floor, we're energy independent. We don't care about the Middle East anymore. So they hear that. But what they have said to me is, we need to know who's going to be there for us. If the U.S. leaves the Middle East, who can we count on? And I think, the Abraham Accords is really much about that, was a belief that we can't be assured that the U.S. is going to be there. We could try, but we have to also think for ourselves beyond oil. How do we diversify our economies? How do we digitize? And who does digitization better than Israel? Israel, they said they can't leave the Middle East. They live in the Middle East. So they're a stabilizer against Iran. And look, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but what happened on April 13th, 14th might, sound like to you like something from the, we're living in the Mashiach times, a messianic movement. Things are coming so fast and furious, we don't even have time to digest what just happened less than a month ago. Less than a month. The idea, if you would have said that in the middle of a war where Israel is being, excoriated in all directions, the US, Britain, France, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar at a certain point, the Emirates in certain ways, would all be coming together to knock down Iranian drones fired at Israel. You'd say, no way. Come on, get real. And I think for American Jews who grew up thinking that the Arabs are the enemy, to see that it's the Arabs that are coming to Israel's defense is shocking. It's astonishing for all of us to see this thing play out. But for those of us who've been following it, it's actually, there's been a whole pattern of this, something called CENTCOM. CENTCOM is the U.S. Central Military Command. And here now, since the Abraham Accords, Israel, Saudi Arabia, all the Gulf states, even Pakistan, I believe, all sit in the same room dealing with early detection of air missile defense. And all looking at the same screens, all looking at the same drones and saying, we're all on the same side. Now, this would have been to people think would be crazy, but welcome to the new Middle East. For all the problems with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, the flip side is that these other countries, they don't want these people to succeed. And a lot of these Arab state leaders will say, Israel, you got to get rid of Hamas. but do me a favor, do it by 6 a.m. in the morning and have no Al Jazeera cameras, which is not possible. So Israel's enemies and their enemies are the same. And maybe we talk more about Saudi Arabia. We could see how, as I had a U.S. diplomat in Saudi Arabia just say to me, you think the Saudis didn't see what happened on April 13th, 14th? Of course they saw it. And that means they want a treaty with the U.S. because they see Iran as menacing and as a destabilizing force. They've created an axis of misery in every country they've taken over. So all I'm saying is, sometimes we always we go to like the oy vey school, everything is worse, everything is worse. No, in some ways things are much better. The question is, how do you maintain that momentum? How do you keep that coalition together? How do you cement an anti-Iran alliance in a regional sense? That's the challenge. And it's not something you can assume will do it on its own. No, to maintain that coalition is going to take a lot of effort. And the Palestinian issue is going to get integrated into that. But the point is that for the first time, Israel had a coalition, and it's unclear to me if Israel could have done this by itself. Gallant, the defense minister, says Israel's got like 6 fronts. Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. What does Houthi rebels have to do with Israel? The Khatib Hezbollah of Iran, not to be confused by the Lebanese Hezbollah. All these, the Syria and Iran and Syria, there's just too many fronts. You need a coalition. And this has come together beautifully. And the arrow, which is something, the U.S.-Israel relationship for 25 years, they've worked on this, on developing, hitting a missile with a missile in the outer space, in outside the atmosphere. And it worked. So it was just almost like a symphony that everyone came together, all these countries, and they did it on behalf of Israel. And no one could have predicted that in 2009.
Yeah. First of all, I really appreciate the access of misery description. I've never heard that before. And I think there's a lot to thinking, more about that and how that plays out. I want to turn us to sort of American coverage. We hear a lot of politicians and pundits talking about the Rafah invasion and threats but there's an Israeli side of this, and a certain atonality to what's going on with hostages. So tell us a little bit about what you think Israelis are talking about, what they care about in this new invasion front of the war. We're starting to hear more about soldiers dying once again, that sort of breathlessness as you open the news in the morning, hear what happened, and these beautiful faces of Chayalim as we're thinking about in Yom HaZikaron, and there's always this smiling face of someone who no longer exists in that window of possibility. I mean, it's just tragic, in addition to the time running out for our hostages. So we know what the Americans or American news, how they're covering this invasion. Give us a picture from the Israeli side.
I just want to give you a quick minute, if it's okay, to just say something personal, which is Gadi Eisenkot, who's in the Israeli War Cabinet, was a visiting fellow at my institute, and I got to know him well. And he was here in Washington, and there were 6 kids at a day school in the Washington D.C. area called a community school called, it is, but people around the country might not, called the Charles E. Smith School. Jewish day school called JDS here. And there were 6 kids that wanted to go to Israel and to the army. And they were, really wanted to meet Gadi. And it came to me with this idea, would they, they would like to meet Gadi. I said, well, this is his call. It's to meet students. And he said, sure, I'll meet them. And he met their parents. He took them for lunch at Char Bar. And one of the kids that he met, my daughter knew at JDS, he was the first American killed in this war, right? He was called up after October 7th, and he went right over to Israel. And I mentioned to Gadi that he was, killed, and because I knew his family was now back in Israel, in Herzliya, right near where Gadi lived. Turns out Gadi went to the shiva every day of this kid from the Washington, D.C. area. And I thought, you know, I said, you might be too busy.
A hero
But
and a mensch, a hero and a mensch.
yeah, he was. And then, but the end sad part of the story that gets even worse is that I'd been over Gadi's house for dinner, and I'd met his whole family, and including his son, who was spending that summer in the United States because he wanted to be a camp counselor to meet American Jews. He'd never met American Jews. And this kid was killed too. Gadi Eisenkot's son was killed. And I got the word when I was in Abu Dhabi in the UAE at a conference. I got 2 urgent calls. They wanted to tell me before it was announced. And I was so shocked. My wife went to the funeral the next day. And I said, the first day we're in Israel, we're going to Gadi's to the Shiva. And he see him at the Shiva. He gives me this big bear hug. And he said, you know, that boy that Omer Balva, that died and that I went to the Shiva for, that I met in Washington. So my son Gal is buried literally next to that boy. And that just kind of blew me away, that Gadi Eisenkot's son and this boy, Omer Balva, were buried next to each other in the Herzliya cemetery. And it reminded me of some of the bonds between the U.S. and Israel, and how close that relationship.
The destiny of the Jewish people, right? The destiny of the Jewish people, the sense of Israel being the great project of the Jewish people,
right? Exactly.
World over.
So this is, you know, October 7th has hit people in different ways, but that was really something. Now, to get to your question, I'm not trying to avoid it. Look, if I zoomed out for a second, I'd say, okay, what is America and Israel trying to do? What is the big picture? What I think the U.S. wants to do has been putting all of its eggs, Erica, in a kind of a hostage for pause deal. Is to say, look, there hasn't really, the fighting was been most intense was in the end of October, November, December, and January. Since then, all of the reserves have basically gone home. There have been some that have been called back, but relatively few. So the net effect is that now, as you pointed out, that the fighting looks like it might be restarting. But the concept was to get a deal where you would get at least some of the hostages out. First, you would have like a 6-week pause. And the United States has expended a lot of effort. Bill Burns, who's the CIA director, he has been spending most of the last few months like going around the Middle East to try to get this deal. And the U.S. hoped that after it got this deal, they would use the pause to pivot to a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal. But the problem of that approach, which I think was a very noble approach, and I still think the right approach, is that it does give Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, a veto. Because he might think, well, I'm going to be able to cut this deal. If they do this deal, then they're going to leave me for the Saudis. And so I'll get what I don't want, which is I don't want a Saudi-Israeli normalization thing at all. So I think the effort was the right effort to do a hostage for pause thing. It's not simple for Israel. Again, like I don't want to bore people with all the details, and some of you know the details, but it's, Israel would be having to yield many prisoners back on the streets. Hamas wants a veto. I mean, for 4 women who are hostage, who were soldiers, they want for each woman who were usually what they call lookout people. They sat in front of a screen, many of them just looking at the border on October 7th. They want like 50 killers on the street for one, and there's 4 of them. And then they want others out like that. But it's also would be a massive moral defeat for Israel if 133 hostages died in the tunnels of Hamas. I mean, it's a tribute to Israel.
Such a no-win, right?
I mean, it's a tribute to, that what you say in Pirkei Avot, Hamatzil nefesh echad, matzil olam kulo, that if you save one person, you save the world. And Israel took that seriously in 2011. It released 1,027 prisoners for one Corporal Gilad Shalit. problem is one of those 1,027 was a guy by the name of Yahya Sinwar, who went on to lead the attacks. So, I mean, this is a problem set from hell. What do you do? But it's a tribute
The
to
moral
the Israeli
dimensions of this on every level,
Right.
the killing of Gaza innocents, the humanitarian aid questions.
Right.
It's so entangled
Right.
and
It is. It is.
intractable. It's really
No, it is. And like I said, like what that guy said to me at the White House, this is a problem set from hell. And
but
and
you still
Israel's
have to
trying
solve.
to
You
navigate
still have
it.
to solve problems from hell, right? In other words,
Right.
it's
Right.
I
Yeah.
actually I've just been reviewing a lot of Rabbi Sacks's writing in his book
Yeah.
Lessons in Leadership, where he sort of talks about despair and he talks about conviction and how you maintain what you deeply believe as an authentic self,
Right.
even in the face of situations which seem so bleak that you just can't see the other side of it. And actually, I sort of want to, we have a number of students who are listening and those who will watch the video recording because they're studying for finals, David. I hope.
I heard.
Or they're writing their papers. And I actually want to sort of take them in to the way in which you think about, you don't have a normal job, right? A normal desk job in that sense.
Yeah.
Friends of mine who work in Middle East policy say the conflict has lasted so long that they'll always have a job, right? And I was, they're never, the problem's never going to be over. And we may joke about it, but it's a field which seems, especially now, to change hour by hour. When you think your job hasn't gotten easier in certain ways, it's gotten more complex.
Right.
How did you choose? You were thinking about being a sports broadcaster, right? So how did you, which is sort of peaceful and happy and competitive, but it's very different.
Yeah.
Now you think about where you are now. Do you have these moments where you say, you worked in the State Department, I can't, how do I move this forward? Is there a legacy here?
Right. Look, you always think about, like I said, you might not hit the home run. You want to hit at least some singles and doubles. If you said, I actually saw someone showed me a video of David Wolpe, who is a rabbi, and someone said, "What gives you hope?" He said, "What gives me hope is I imagine this conversation with my great grandfather. There's some tensions between the U.S. and Israel. The U.S. has been Israel's biggest supporter." And he goes, wait, there's an Israel? I had no idea, And they goes, well, yeah, they want to shave some, funds or weapons from the $3.8 billion they give. They give Israel billions of dollars. So, I mean, we take for granted now things that our grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents would have never imagined possible. When Shimon Peres wrote a book, We Dream Too Small. Would he have dreamed that this is a country that of almost 10 million people? Would he have dreamed that this is a country that has a per capita income on the size of Germany, Japan, France, and the United Kingdom? Would he dream that this is a country with high-tech bases, was considered almost like a superpower? He wouldn't have dreamed that way. So, I mean, sometimes we need to step back and see what is accomplished. Look, for me, you asked me, Erica, what had a big impact on my life? I was 17 years old, okay? And I saw Anwar Sadat getting off that plane from Egypt to Israel. And as a 17-year-old, I was just blown away. That was my kind of formative experience. I just thought, it made me really believe in the big person of history idea, that leadership, I know you run a center on leadership, but leadership is decisive. It's everything. Without Sadat, this wouldn't have happened. One person drove history. And I think I knew enough at 17, although I admit maybe I didn't know that much, but I knew that Egypt was the biggest state. And I thought, wow, Egypt is out of the war circle. Then there's no wars, no more interstate wars. Syria won't fight Israel on its own. And that's what happened. Of course, I didn't see, Hezbollah starting in 1982. This was 1977. But
terror is a whole different kind of modern warfare.
Right. Terror is a totally different thing.
Yeah.
But interstate wars, that would be the end. So, to me, that was if I had a coming of age moment, Erica, that was it. And why do I persevere? Because I believe as an American that a strong Israel, especially if it could be at peace with its neighbors, It's critical for American national interest. And I believe that against destabilizing forces of Iran and its proxies, and especially given what I was saying to you before about CENTCOM and all this stuff, where now the Arabs and the Israelis are on the same side. And I know YU students will be amazed if I tell you that a fourth of all Israeli arms exports of the state of Israel, don't fall off your chair, but a fourth goes to Arab countries now. A fourth. Who would have believed that? My great-grandfather wouldn't have believed this was possible. They would say, no, Esav Soin Yaakov, that this guy hated this guy forever and nothing's going to change. And I'm not trying to denigrate any statements of others, but I'm just saying that this is a revolution. I also think, look, Zionism understood something. Chaim Weizmann, Ben Gurion, and writing these books, you see it. They believe that if Israel is going to have a future, it needed to link itself to the superpower, to the main country in the world. In the early days, that was Britain, the Balfour Declaration. Weizmann lived in London. There was a reason for that, So I mean, and then after World War II, as Britain kind of recedes, the United States comes to the fore. So I think if you believe in Zionism, you believe that there has to be a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. So as an American, I think it's good for us in America, but I think Israel has always understood U.S.'s relations are good for it. And I think I'm fortunate to live at this, at this intersection between the two. And I think the question, though, for me is it going to be able to keep going? And it gets us back to what we were saying about earlier, which is values and interests. And I'm worried. I have to admit, I'm worried. I don't want to sound, and I'm not a pessimist. I don't want to be a skunk at a garden party, but I do worry about domestic dynamics in both Israel and the United States that are tearing at the fabric of this relationship. And that scares me because I do worry that there are, whether it's on the hard left in America or the hard right in America or in the hard right in Israel, I'm sorry to say, there are forces that are not as committed to this relationship. And, it's not just about common interests, because interests tend to bind governments. But what Israel has going for it is common values that the American people and the Israeli people think we are the same. As part of it is a Judeo-Christian ethic, you can say, but it's also about being committed to a set of Western liberal ideas. And if you have, a hard right in Israel that's not committed to it, or a left wing in America that's not committed to it, or a hard right in America not committed to it, maybe because the hard right elements are isolationists in this country, or the hard left, doesn't think there should be an Israel, or people in Israel who says we don't need anybody. We can, do what we want with Palestinians. That's going to tear at the fabric of this country and of this relationship that is so vital. It's, every general I meet a lot of generals, and every general says after Tzahal, after the IDF, the most important security pillar for the state of Israel is a strong relationship with the U.S. You cannot take that for granted, that will always be there. And the key is through common values, not just common interests. And I hope that people, at the hard edges of this debate, realize if they care about Israel, and I know they do, that they need to think about how to sustain this relationship over time.
Yeah, and also it's interesting because from when you first started your work as the editor at the Jerusalem Post, and then you're writing for Haaretz, we got news in a different way. Everyone wasn't a broadcaster, right? Everybody didn't have an opinion, no matter how ill-informed that opinion was. So, one of your great strengths, David, at least for me, when I seek your counsel and trying to think about issues that are complex this way, is the capacity to be, number one, optimistic and hopeful, and two, to really zoom out and, as we say in leadership literature, take the view from the balcony. It's really been hard to have the view from the balcony right now when we're just we're ground zero, the Nova Festival, right? I'm thinking, I every day I change this, my number on the back of my dog tag. And, I find sometimes I'm seeing Achenu and I'm holding on to it. And I as if I can't forget for one moment what people are going through, what hostages are going through, what parents are going through, what children are going through as they wait to hear about parents. And I think to myself, one day I hope, Ezrat Hashem, God gives you strength and long life, you'll write a memoir and you'll have a chapter. And I'm wondering how you're going to, like, if you could write this chapter, what would you want to say about it? The long view of
I think I still have confidence in the people of Israel that ultimately Israel's willingness to live is greater than its enemies' willingness to die. So in the most literal sense, Am Yisrael Chai, literally, that I really truly believe in this, what I was saying about the resilience, the perseverance, and the sense of resolve. It depends how this period ends. I mean, if it ends with Hamas being defeated, when I say defeated, you're never going to take Hamas out of the hearts and minds of people. It's going to be a terror group out there. But I'm talking about being toppled from power, because as so long as the people who fire the shots call the shots, there's no hope. I say this on television all the time. There's no hope for, if you care about a Palestinian state or whatever you care about, there's no hope for that if Hamas is in charge. And I can tell you, as someone who was in the US government when this happened, I feel people say, well, the people are frustrated. I feel like, well, yeah, you're frustrated. You don't burn somebody alive. You don't rape them. You don't decapitate them. You don't bludgeon babies. You don't do that. That's not frustration. But it's not just there's because there's no state, there's this radicalism. Because of the radicalism, there's no state. I mean, because Hamas is just too strong.
There's an acceptance of savagery, even in places where we least expected it, right? In the halls of higher education, you just don't expect it. And now I think that when it starts becoming normative to hear these things, we also internalize stereotype threats, right? So it's like, how do you feel, where do you go from here? And
100%.
Yeah.
No, I mean, your question about the history, to me is, you write the history after the period ends. So if Hamas is still in power, this will embolden Hamas. It'll embolden all sorts of terror groups across the Middle East. As one senior Arab said to me, God help us if, Hamas, comes out of this ahead. But I think if Hamas, on the other hand, is defeated, I think there is greater hope for Israelis and Palestinians. And it'll also strengthen, I think, the U.S. and Israeli-Arab relationships. I mean, it is important to note that none of the Abraham Accord countries or Egypt or Jordan have cut ties during this period. And actually after October 7th, the Bahrainis and the UAE on some level, they condemned what Hamas did as terrorism. Now, it's clear that this is all this stuff on television. There's a lot of pressure, and one of the Arab leaders, one of the person's top advisor, and I had a conversation in the Persian Gulf, and he said to me, David, there's the war you see and there's the war you don't see. The war you see is Gaza. The war you don't see is how the Islamist forces are trying to topple all of us in the Middle East. So we're clearly rooting for Israel. But they don't say that publicly, and that's the problem. People don't hear that. But your question about how is history going to look? It's going to depend on how the period ends. Right. If Hamas is toppled and more moderate forces come in, and the Gulf states understand that if they don't get behind this, this is coming to a theater near you. And by the way, the need for a strategy, Erica, is not just on the Arabs. Right. Israel. I mean, when there's quotes here about Herzi Halevi, the IDF chief of staff, who I know, who's such a decent person. He's a brilliant guy. I think, look, like a lot of these guys who were, was their watch on October 7th, he's made clear he will resign. But, he said, like, you can't beat something with nothing. If you want to beat Hamas, you have to beat it with who's taking over, who you're turning the baton over to. And that's a key point. And here, I think the domestic politics in Israel have not allowed people to articulate that. So when we say we need a strategy because we need history on our side, we have to defeat Hamas.
Right, we need internally and externally.
Yes, it's not, anybody who tries to take on Hamas when they're in charge will get a bullet in their head. So anyone wants a better future for the Palestinians and wants two states and wants all these things, they have to hope first that Hamas is defeated. But Israel, on its part, also got to realize that if the choice for a Gaza is either Hamas or Somalia, like either Hamas is in charge or there's chaos, guess what? They're going to go for Hamas because you can't ask someone to beat something with nothing. They don't want Somalia. So you've got to get behind something, and I think that something is going to have to be, what Gallant, the defense minister, and all the IDF people say. It's either Hamas or Fatah, and the U.S. trains the Palestinian Authority, and a kind of a secret that's not discussed. It's not a secret even. Is how the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority work together on intelligence. People always ask me, David, how do you cope with such bad news? I said, I get to see the good stuff that you guys don't see. They go, what do you mean? I said, the good stuff I see is I see how the Israelis and Palestinians work together below the radar to solve problems. And I felt what happened on April 13th, 14th with Iran is that all this stuff under the table became above the table. And so the whole world saw it and said, wow, like, how did that happen? It didn't happen out of nowhere. It happened because these relationships exist, because it's just so ironic, Erica, that while the Arabs and Israelis fought each other during the wartime, that the people who made peace first with Israel were the Arab militaries, because the enemies are the same enemies. They don't want ISIS. They don't want Al-Qaeda. They don't want Islamic Jihad. They don't want Hamas. So they're sharing intel. And that's been true with Egypt and Israel. It's been true with Jordan and Israel. And now it's true with the Gulf and Israel. It's remarkable. And that's where that comes from. So you got to nurture those relationships and internalize that for Gaza as well.
Yeah, no, when I think about April 13th, right? And I think about, 170 drones, 30 cruise missiles, 120 ballistic missiles.
Yes.
And then people just, went to the supermarket the next day. It was like, I think that's also about the marvel of history is that you don't see the miracles when you don't get the view from the balcony either, right?
I know.
You don't stand back and say, what is the likelihood?
Yeah. I mean, I think like, if, I had to put this in an Orthodox setting, and I mean this with respect, of course, I kind of think there's part of me that thought after April 13th, 14th, that the Jews would say Hallel after this is over, declared a holiday, and have already selected a menu. Here's the charoset for the drones that we took down. Right. You know what I mean? Like, but things happen so fast. We're on to the next news cycle.
Right. Things that happen so fast. And that's why I said, like, the capacity to stand above it, to transcend it, and sort of give people a way of looking at this period of time, which because it's moved so quickly and because it's been so protracted, it becomes very, very hard to do. So I want to actually close with a question from a different book, a book that is my favorite book of yours, if that's okay to pick a favorite, David.
Yeah, thank you.
You and Dennis wrote another book together in 2019. You authored "Be Strong and of Good Courage: How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny." And I love the framing of it, where you took 4 prime ministers, David Ben-Gurion, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Rabin, Ariel Sharon, and you basically said, they all, in order for them to continue Israel's survival, they had to undercut their own general strategy and political approach. You wrote there that Israel's poor prospects for peace because of ever deepening gaps psychologically between Israelis and Palestinians would only change if leaders are up to making historic decisions.
Yeah, 100%.
When you think about the central thesis of that book and what you did there, what would it take for today's leadership? And there are a lot of different leaders involved in this, to make historic shifts in strategy so that we're behind, this terrible chapter in our history is behind us.
Well, that's a great question. Look, and I want to be clear, like, if there's not a deal, I don't feel it's fair to blame Israel here all the way. I think the Palestinians, I wish they would read the book. I had the Jordanian foreign minister that was saying, I love the book. And he said, I've sent it around to a lot of other Arabs. I didn't know the history. And so, that was I was touched by that. But, clearly, the Israeli leadership, I felt in the 90s with Rabin and with Sharon was that they were willing to go all the way for peace, and I feel Yasser Arafat was not, and Abbas is not, and so I don't want to make it sound it's all Israel's fault. I mean, I don't think that was the case. I think that the commonality, though, those four leaders who made a historic decision, it was Ben-Gurion, despite all the odds, declared that he's going forward on statehood. Begin on peace with Egypt, Rabin on peace with the Palestinians, Sharon on 2005 on the pullout. These were all leaders, Erica, that kind of went through an internal transformation before they made policy decisions. Like Ben-Gurion in 1936, and again, I don't want to bore people, but he admitted publicly, and Ben-Gurion didn't often admit his mistakes. But Ben-Gurion said, I got it wrong. I thought the Arabs were just regional nationalists, that the Palestinian issue wasn't really that important. And I think it's better that we have to share a loaf or be left with no loaf. Now, if they attack us, we could expand our borders, etc. But that took guts for Ben-Gurion. But that was the core that led Truman to support Ben-Gurion, that allowed the partition plan to go forward. I'm just reading Oren Kessler's book called Palestine 1936 on all the drama behind the scenes. And you see how Ben-Gurion and Weizmann realized that taking half a loaf was the way for success. And that was always the secret sauce of Zionism, was pragmatism, yes, ethos of self-reliance, but also a connection with the big power in the world of the day. That combination was a winning combination. And so, but Ben-Gurion had to go through that inner decision before he declared this state. And once he believed in it, then he went all the way. If you look at Begin, he came to the view that, that this is, if you can get Egypt out of the war coalition, there's no war with Arabs, and you could save a lot of Jewish lives. That took guts from a guy who was the leader of Beirut and then became Likud. That took guts. Rabin, paid for with his life. Sharon, was branded a traitor. But they believed ultimately that the country first. And I think, without, getting into, politics here, I think that's what we have to wish for Israel's leaders,
and also America's leaders.
And America's leaders too, that it's always country first. And that is what made them great, that they were willing to deal with the consequences, and they became convinced that their judgment was, this is good in the national interest. And I think that's very central, a lesson for the United States. It's a lesson for Israel going forward. But that to get to your center, leadership makes all the difference. And that's why we focus on it so much, because we see how decisive it can be.
Yeah, I think this Yom HaZikaron leading to Yom HaTzmaut, the message "country first" is a really important one. David, I can't thank you enough on this 219th day of the war, and with our hostages still captive, to make time in your incredibly busy schedule to talk to us. I'll say, Josh Makovsky, you did a good job raising your father. And we're delighted to have him as a student and you as a parent here at Yeshiva University. And Chazak v'amatz, be strong and of good courage yourself on college campuses and in the really sacred and important work that you do every single day. Thank you for your service. And I want to thank everyone here for joining us here at the Sacks-Herenstein Center. The recording will be available and it will be sent out soon, and it was certainly in the Thursday newsletter that we send out every week. Please feel free to listen, share it with friends. And once again, thank you, David, and good night.
Delighted to be with you. Good night.